feel slightly the warm-up act for the royalty that is going to follow me. Sally from the BMA has transformed, I think, the importance that the BMA attaches to bullying. Chris, who's hiding at the back, is just opened people's eyes to incivility, and Amanda, in her own trust, has sort of developed such innovative ways of working that we can all learn from. I've been asked to talk about the national, just set the scene nationally, really. And we're in a peculiar time where kind of bullies appear to become leaders of many of the kind of main nations in the world, and setting completely the opposite example of leadership to that which we want. That makes it more important to talk about this issue, not less important. So some of you will be familiar with this, but just to sort of summarise it, we know nationally that almost a quarter of staff report that they were bullied or harassed by colleagues or their managers in the previous year. We know that less than half report that bullying and harassment, and the figures have gone in the opposite direction. So the figures who say that they were bullied or harassed have gone up in recent years. The numbers saying that they've reported it have not gone up, gone the opposite direction. More generally, we have a context where the NHS is underfunded, whatever, is she still here? Whatever the Prime Minister says, we don't have enough money for the NHS. We won't have enough money, even with the extra money. So there's always going to be pressures and changes, and the research says those are sort of very ripe, make it very ripe for stress and bullying and so on. So we know that there are real pressures on staff and on managers within the NHS. Why does that matter? It matters for three reasons: because it impacts on staff, it impacts on patients, and it impacts on organisations. And I've just summarised some of this, and there may be a tiny bit of overlap with what Chris says and what Sally say. We know, and you may have seen it sometimes, the impact on not just the mental health of colleagues, but the physical health, cardiovascular impact, all sorts of other impacts. It can be devastating. In extreme cases, it leads to suicide. We know that there's a causal relationship, not just a correlative one. In other words, we know it's caused by bullying rather than it happens to be some numbers that match up. And we know that it impacts as a result of that on absenteeism, job satisfaction, intention to leave, commitment and so on. And I'll return to that in a moment. So we know that for individual members of staff, not just those who are bullied, but those who witness bullying, there's an increasing literature around the impact on people who witness bullying, on people who stay at work, even if they're bullied or if they're in teams where bullying's taking place. We know, and there's much more evidence now than there was a decade ago, we know that bullying impacts on whether staff raise concerns. One or two of you will have read the Francis Report 2015, which looked at the kind of impact of bullying on whether staff are willing to raise concerns. Interestingly, disproportionately poorer results for BME staff being affected on all 7 main measures. BME staff were more likely to be ignored or victimised if they raised those issues. We know there's a whole range of evidence linking bullying to patient care. In fact, it's hard to think of a major scandal where bullying hasn't been one of the factors involved. And so I'm not going to take you through the details of that, other than to say there's lots and lots of evidence. And Chris may talk about the Riskin report, which is, if you look online, it's a really interesting example, looking at how paediatric teams are affected just by one of the people observing them being rude. And as Lucian Leap, if you have not read his stuff, it's really interesting. Talks about disrespect in medicine. Why does it affect patient care? Because staff who are bullied are less likely to raise concerns, less likely to admit mistakes, and as Michael West has shown, less likely to work in effective teams. And then there's the financial impact, and Duncan Lewis and myself recently published an estimate. It is an estimate, but it's a kind of, I think, a reasonably well-founded estimate of the cost of bullying as a result of I've listed them there: sickness absence, presenteeism, turnover, productivity loss when you're replacing people, and so on. And that is £2.2 billion at least. We didn't include primary care, we didn't include national NHS organisations, we didn't include witnesses, we didn't include incivility. So it's at least that amount of money. So that's staff, organisations, and above all else, patient care. So it's important. And if you haven't read Mary Dixon Wood's article, it's a free online download. It's a really good piece of research that's easy to read and which kind of captures some of this stuff. And as Wes shows, there's a inverse relationship between whether staff report bullying and the overall patient experience. I'm not going to talk about the UMHB data because David's going to talk about, other than to say you are about the average. You are slightly worse on whether staff report being bullying, slightly better on whether staff report bullying, significantly worse for the experience of BME staff and staff with disabilities. That's a national pattern, but it's a very obvious one. Interesting differences between different sites. I mean, I'd be interested in knowing, why is it significantly better at Furness than it is at other sites? Why is it different for some occupations rather than others? But I know David's going to talk about some of that. But it varies nationally. So some organisations are complete car crashes. Other organisations clearly are getting something right. So what do we do about it? And unfortunately, many of the things we've done in the past, they remind me of that old Einstein quote: you keep doing the same thing and expecting different results as an early sign of insanity. Were unevidenced. People couldn't answer the question, why do you think this is likely to work? So the emphasis was on policies, procedures and training, primarily, as if they were going to be the drivers of changes in culture. Now, you do need those, but in isolation, they don't work. And they don't work because if you look at the bottom quote, which was taken down off the NHS employers website 2 years ago, after I complained about it, employers can only address cases of bullying and harassment that brought to their attention. It was an individualistic approach. It relied on individuals complaining about bullying rather than the organisation, as Aaron has just done, taking responsibility and being proactive and taking, if you like, a public health approach to bullying and recognising this organisational climate that causes bullying, rather than somehow or other corporate psychopaths, which are present in every organisation. What is it that allows them to do what they do, rather than they themselves being a problem? They are a problem, but they're not the key problem. So to understand it, there's all sorts of evidence. I think this is a really nice summary from a piece of research done about 5 years ago by Carter, which listed why people said, big piece of research in there, was why people said they didn't raise concerns. They didn't think it would make a difference, didn't want to be seen as difficult. They thought that the fact that the bully was senior to them would be a real problem, thought things might get worse, didn't think anything would happen. That would be familiar with you. It's familiar in every organisation. It's a real problem, and it emphasises that it's not enough to rely on individuals having the courage or sometimes the foolishness to raise concerns. We have to go a bit further. And the other side of that kind of challenge is whether we look at group interactions, what's going on with individuals or within teams, primarily, or whether we look at the overall organisational climate, which will include those things, but which focuses on the deeper systemic challenges. And Fever and colleagues say bullying reported by public sector employers primarily due to experiencing constant change, increased workload and quality pressures, and they distinguish between social or group approaches which focus on interactions within a group and organisational approaches which try to look at the system as a whole, which is not an alternative to look at what happens within the group, but try to look at the wider, deeper problems. So, this is really just underlining what I was saying earlier, but perhaps just picking a couple of things out. If you don't respond, if you are not proactive and don't go out looking for bullying, and you wait for people to raise concerns, and then you take a long time intervening. By the time you do intervene, the trenches are dug, it becomes intractable. You end up, in previous life I was a trade union official, you end up with literally shopping trolleys of documents explaining why or why not people are being bullied. So understanding that, which I think you do, but lots of organisations still don't, is really important, and that's relevant nationally, because nationally there's talk, and I'll touch on it in a moment, about initiatives to take bullying more seriously nationally, but it's not clear to me that they really understand this issue. For example, there has been talk about a national helpline on bullying. My view on that is a complete waste of time. What are people going to say when you ring up? If the issue is an organisational one, what is it you're going to say to individuals other than, be strong, be resilient? So I like the approach that says bullying is a health and safety risk. This is now quite commonly an approach in Australia and New Zealand. And we have a statutory framework that I'm not suggesting we necessarily have to use that statutory framework, but it helps to frame the approach we take, which says that employers should undertake risk assessments, which is what the best employers are now doing, being proactive, not waiting for things to happen, but taking initiatives and acting on them. I'll give an example. It's a trust, not this trust where the chief executive and the medical director knew that there was a problem in a particular large department. They knew from their staff survey, they knew from exit interviews, they knew from a whole range of other workforce data, but nobody in this department would come forward and raise a concern. So people were leaving, but nobody wanted to raise it. So the chief exec and the medical director, who had a practice of every Thursday morning, they would go sit in the department, just have cups of tea with people. They went to this department, spent 4 hours there having cups of tea with people, moving around. Nobody raised the issue of bullying. Now, that was clearly, they knew that was the big issue. So they walked off, decided, we better go. They walked down the corridor, long corridor, and as they were about to turn the corner, the medical director said to the chief exec, some of the people who we've talked to are following us. So they went down the corner and, like a pair of muggers, waited for them to come, and they said, we need to speak to you. So the chief exec said, okay, come into this room. So they went to the room. So it's terrible where we are. Bullying is really serious. People are really cheesed off. It's dysfunctional. It affects how people work. People are leaving. If we weren't where we were, even more people would leave. And so the chief exec said, look, we need you to collectively raise this as an issue, and I will make sure that there's no consequences for you. So the chief exec, so they did that. Eventually, they persuaded them to put something in writing and so on. Next morning, the chief exec went to see the head of this very big department and said, look, we were here yesterday and people talked to us about bullying. And she said, I know who it was. And he said, no, we know it's an issue. We've got all sorts of data that says it's an issue. Can we just sit down and talk about it? She said, I know it was. He said, look, if you can't acknowledge that there's a problem, I'm going to have to do something I don't really want to do. So can we start again? We have everything says there's a problem here. I know who it was. He said, well, I'm going to suspend you. And afterwards, he did. And they raised a collective grievance and it was upheld. And he said to me, I really, really, really didn't want to do that. But I got to the point where that was the only way of making it safe for people to raise concerns. The point of the story is not that he suspended her, but that they took the initiative to go and find the problem. And that, it seems to me, is the cornerstone, acknowledging the problem and taking the initiative to tackle the kind of the more systemic basis of it. So nationally, 2 years ago, there was a national call to action on bullying. Who's heard of the national call to action on bullying? There's a couple of anoraks in the room. It failed. You're no typical to... It'd be the same sort of people who put their hands up. Everywhere I go, I ask the question. Everywhere I get the same answer. It died without trace. And it died without trace because it was somebody decided something had to be done. The minister made a speech, big press releases were put out. It went to the Social Partnership Forum. They said, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. Nothing happened because there wasn't really an acknowledgement of the sorts of things that Aaron was talking about. This is deep-rooted at a local level, and we have to do both support organisations who want to change things and challenge those who don't. But the new Secretary of State, if you follow me on Twitter, I'm not a great fan of the government, but the new Secretary of State seems to be taking bullying a bit more seriously, as does the chair of NHS Improvement. And there are things that they are planning that hopefully will make it a bit easier for organisations who want to do things, and will put pressure on organisations that don't. So the report that Duncan Lewis and myself brought out about 3 weeks ago is going to, I think, be used as a basis to say to organisations, you now need to work out what this costs you at a local level. We published the report in the Finance Directors Theoretical Journal, so that finance directors who probably, is the finance director here?
You've got an excellent sat here.
I want my expenses paid. So finance directors might just listen to numbers in the way that they don't necessarily, some of them, listen to other things. So there's a powerful argument there. The stuff around civility that Chris will talk about later, I think, has finally got some traction. I think people finally recognise the things that there's a kind of continuum really from very over-in-your-face bullying through to rudeness and incivility. That's really important. That has big impacts, and there's lots of data now around that. The CQC has introduced its new fit and proper person guidance that bullying and victimisation is serious misconduct and management. It means that directors who engage in it or collude in it and don't do anything, that means you're not a fit and proper person to lead an organisation. And I'll put it in red. Organisations at national level have to apply to themselves the standards they expect of local organisations. There's no point in NHS Improvement sticking out really good guidance about bullying if the way that they treat some organisations is to bully them, which then cascades. If you get a phone call from the minister, if Aaron gets a phone call from a minister over his bacon sandwich on a Sunday morning, he's obliged to take it. I'm not saying you do, but chief execs used to take it to his management team on a Monday morning. Quick, what are we going to do about this? And that inevitably cascades through the organisation. However good the chief exec is, those pressures are felt. So national organisations have NHS England, NHSI, Health Education England, the Department of Health have to apply to themselves, organisations like the CQC, themselves the standards they expect of others. And although there's no quick fix, we do know some of the things that work. The first thing is to acknowledge the problem, understand the problem. If you think about, if there's an outbreak of MRSA on the wards, we don't just get in a huddle and decide to do things. We kind of listen to staff, we talk to patients, we read the literature, we find out if other organisations have had similar problems. And then if we find places that have tried to address those issues and have had some success, we then find ways of adapting or adopting them to our own environment, not just lifting them, but thinking through what are the principles. And so if that's good enough for what doctors, nurses and other clinicians do, it's good enough for issues that are HR issues. We need to do that. We need to acknowledge and understand the problem. We need to drill down. Accountability on all issues to do with culture is crucial. Those who lead have to model the behaviours they expect of others. They have to hold themselves accountable. They have to hold their managers accountable. I don't necessarily mean in some kind of Stalinist way, but there has to be accountability and openness about the issue. People have to understand the narrative. This is not just about, it's not just morally wrong because it's in the NHS Constitution. It's because it's bad for patient care, bad for staff, bad for organisations. Training can be very helpful, but only if there's a critical mass of people doing it, led by the top, not just a few volunteers. And the training has to be stuff that's linked directly to the issues of organisational culture, not what the policies and procedures are. You have to give support to people where that's necessary, because it's not going to disappear straight away. And there has to be a consistent approach to it. And hopefully that doesn't often mean direct action against bullies, but sometimes it will do. And I'll finish with an example that one of you may have heard me say before. Actually, let me leave that up. So in Hull and East Yorkshire, the lady who's now the deputy medical director, who had been in charge of the training, ran a big programme in an organisation that's been through some of the journey you have, actually. They had a terrible problem with bullying. The chief executive went. CQC were going to come back and said, we need to see evidence of what you're doing on bullying. And eventually they persuaded her, an Asian doctor, to lead on bullying, because she was the only person in the organisation that was doing anything. So she reluctantly agreed on 2 conditions. Number 1, that she would run a massive programme where she would expect every member of staff to go through, that she would personally run. And secondly, she became the trust ombudswoman on bullying, which meant that within the same day, if somebody raised an issue, they would get a response the same day. So she ran this big programme, and being a doctor, there were all sorts of metrics and graphs showing that this was starting to have an impact. And after 2 years, she then moved on from talking about bad behaviours to talking about good behaviours. And then a group of Asian doctors came to see her. Actually, I'm not sure if it was just Asian doctors, but a group of Asian staff came to see her and said, it's really bad where we are. And she said, what do you mean? You know who I am. Most of you have been in my training programme. Why haven't you raised this earlier? And they said, because only now do we think it's safe to do so. And I think that's a really good test, actually. When people feel it's safe to openly speak about these things, it doesn't take away the responsibility of the organisation to use intelligence to intervene, but it's a good test of whether you're starting to make progress, and the benefits will be seen for all. So nationally, I'm a bit more optimistic than I would have been a couple of years ago. You're in a position where you've made real progress on lots of issues, but as Aaron said, that is still a challenge. It's a particular challenge in particular parts of the organisation, but I thought it might be useful just to set out the national picture. Thank you.